interactions that God has with people. I don't know why it doesn't get preached more. I don't know why doesn't get taught more. Usually, when people make a movie of people make a movie about the Ten Commandments or about Exodus, you get the Red Sea, everything up to the Red Sea, and then the next scene is he's on Mount Sinai and he's getting the commandments down, or he's bringing the commandments down. Prince of Egypt, cartoon, 1999, something like that. Uh, they get out, and there's a big happy song, and then he comes down off the mountain and he brings the tablets down. So Red Sea, go to the mountain, get the tablets, get the Ten Commandments. Exodus, which was an awful movie, similar kind of situation. Get across the Red Sea, then you see Moses hammering out tablets. I can't remember if the one with Charlton Heston, I can't remember how that ends, but I think it was the same kind of thing. Red Sea, tablets. Well, in between the Red Sea and the tablets, there's a lot of stuff that happens. And what I pulled out for you guys in the 19th chapter of Exodus is a pivotal conversation that just gets overlooked. And it reads, exactly 2 months after the Israelites left Egypt, they arrived in the wilderness of Sinai. After breaking camp at Rephidim, they came to the wilderness of Sinai and set up camp there at the base of Mount Sinai. Then Moses climbed the mountain to appear before God. The Lord called to him from the mountain and said, give these instructions to the family of Jacob. Announce it to the descendants of Israel. You see what I did to the Egyptians. You know how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you will obey me and keep my covenant, you will be my own special people or treasure from among all the people of earth. For all the earth belongs to me. And you will be my kingdom of priests, my holy nation. This is the message you must give to Israel. So Moses returned from the mountain and called the elders of the people together and told them everything the Lord commanded him. And all the people responded, we will do everything the Lord has commanded. So Moses brought the people's answer back to the Lord. Then the Lord said to Moses, I will come to you in a thick cloud, Moses, so the people themselves can hear me when I speak with you. Then they will always trust you. Then we jump down to, now Moses told the Lord what the people had said. Then the Lord told Moses, go down and prepare the people for my arrival. Consecrate them today and tomorrow and have them wash their clothing. Be sure they are ready on the third day, for on that day the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai as all the people watch. So Moses went down to the people. He consecrated them for worship. He washed their clothes. He told them, get ready for the third day, and until then, abstain from sexual intercourse. On the morning of the third day, thunder roared and lightning flashed, and a dense cloud came down on the mountain. There was a long blast from a ram's horn, and all the people trembled. Moses led them out from camp to meet with God as they stood at the foot of the mountain. All of Mount Sinai was covered with smoke because the Lord had descended on it in the form of fire. The smoke billowed in the skyline, and the smoke billowed in the skyline, sky-like smoke from a brick kiln, and the whole mountain shook violently. And as the blast of the ram's horn grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God thundered his reply. So we're going to start with the first 3 verses of this, and we're going to break some of this down and look at how the principles we've looked at from communication apply to this passage as well. First 3 verses. 2 months after Israel left Egypt, they arrived at the wilderness. Moses climbs the mountain to appear before God, and God tells him, go and give this message to Israel. Having departed from Egypt by way of the Red Sea and carrying uncounted amounts of gold, silver, jewels, and livestock with them, they journeyed back to the mountain at which God made his introduction to Moses. So, burning bush, Mount Sinai. They leave Egypt, come back to Mount Sinai. This mountain is now sacred, and only Moses makes his way up. It's sacred and it's consecrated because this is where Moses met God. Moses goes up by himself. He doesn't take the entire nation. The remainder of the Hebrew remained at the base of the mountain. They have not been initiated and have no right to encroach upon sacred space. We talked about that in second or third lesson, the 3 phases of restricted space, sacred space, and then common space, just as a motif. Just to, if you remember that, we kind of touched on that. Even though they had been delivered from Egypt, they had not yet entered into a relationship with God. I could preach that, but I'm not here to do it. Even though they had been delivered from Egypt, they had not entered into a relationship with God. So they couldn't go up the mountain yet. Over the course of those 2 months, in Exodus 16 to 18, so I'm bridging a little bit of history here, a few important things happen. Israel complains of being hungry, and God provides quails and manna. That happens in the 16th chapter. Israel complains of being thirsty, and God provides clean water from a rock. Happened in the 17th chapter. Some of this is probably familiar to you all hearing about Israel's story. Israel is attacked by another nation, and God enables Israel to defeat them. These experiences serve as relationship building exercises wherein God shows that he is able to provide food, water, and security for the Hebrew people. In these chapters, he does not chide or rebuke the people of Israel, as they complain and say they would have been better off dying in Egypt. They don't know who this God is yet. They only know that he brought them out, and gods were known to be very unpredictable and very fickle. God forbears with their ignorance and proves himself to be a capable God. So bringing you up to the 19th chapter, just setting a context, 16, 17, and 18 is not as relevant, but 16 and 17, they're out of Egypt. They start complaining that they're hungry. God provides them food. They complain that they're thirsty. God provides them water. Somebody tries to pick a fight with them. God enables them to win the battle. They have all of these experiences before the 10 Commandments are ever given, just out the gate. These experiences stand as a form of indirect impersonal communication, wherein God allows circumstance or happenstance to point to truths about what he can do without directly addressing the people or revealing anything about his discernible character. As of yet, these are not his people, even though he has blessed and delivered them. In seeking to understand how God may tend to communicate with a person, it's important to understand the difference between being a blessed person and being in a relationship with him. God tends to communicate with people on the basis of their relationship with them. In other words, they've been delivered, they've got manna from heaven, they've got water, God's given them military victories, but as of yet, these are still not God's people. They have not committed and engaged in a relationship with him, which is why when they get to the mountain, they can't go up the mountain. A lot of times people associate the blessings with having made commitment. I'm blessed, I'm in a relationship with God. It's a little bit more complicated than that. And it's important to understand the difference between being engaged in a relationship and getting stuff and being blessed. So there's one of the principles there. This is all indirect communication. These are, I'm out in the wilderness, I'm hungry, I need food, God sends me food. Oh, God can feed me. I'm out in the wilderness, I'm thirsty, God sends me water. Oh, God. We still haven't gotten to God's character yet, but they are casual encounters in day-to-day life that point to the existence of God and give you some idea of that he's there and that he does exist. A lot of people's understanding and exposure to God stops right there. Having spent 2 months living under the care and the provision of God, he is ready to approach the people about a change in the nature of their relationship. Indirect communication can be and often is a precursor to a proposal from God. However, God does not interact directly with the people. Rather, he calls Moses into sacred space. Once again, going back to your isolation principle that we talked about earlier. We're going back to being isolated, and I'm calling Moses out, and we're going to talk, and he's going to talk, and I'm going to speak to the people through him. Herein, we have an opportunity to talk about a mechanism in which God communicates with people. We talked about he communicates with people in isolation. God speaks to people through other people. And there's a few people, somebody may wonder, why does he do that? Why doesn't he just speak directly to me? He does. That's one of the ways he does it. But he also speaks to people through others. And there's a few different reasons for that. In this case, he's speaking through Moses because he's got a prior relationship with Moses. He has made Moses priest and prophet, and he has been initiated. I think what I put in your notes is that the recipient of the communication may be uninitiated. That means that there's no actual relationship yet or basis for me to be able to interact with you directly. So I'm going to send somebody that I do interact with directly to talk to you. Sometimes the recipient is distracted or unconsecrated. The recipient has sometimes broken covenant relationship with God, thereby precluding direct communication. The nature of the message can sometimes be easier processed through human interaction than divine discourse. And it's a continuation of God's divine imperative for human partnership with Him. So, in other words, there's a few reasons why God might not speak to people directly. Sometimes the person's not in a position to be able to hear it, either spiritually or mentally. Life gets nuts. Sometimes life gets so nuts that it can cloud your ability to hear. You are so distracted and so busy that He can get somebody else to get your attention rather than him having to get your attention. Sometimes the messages that have to be carried can be accepted and be processed easier through a person than they can be than they would be through divine communication. Us sitting here talking about this stuff, breaking these down, it's a lot more tangible. It's a lot more concrete than having stuff in your head, wondering, is this God, is this not God, having to try to sort it out. So you have people who can come and interact, and God can speak through those people. And it also works we've talked about the fact that God wants to partner with people. God partners with people, and this is one of the ways He does it. So that way we interact with each other. Let's see here. Any questions so far? Okay, so God speaks through a person. Sometimes this means a person has already heard directly from God, and as is the case with Moses when he's communicating this message. So God speaks through people. Sometimes the person actually hears from God. God tells them to go and share such and such with somebody. Okay? There are other times where God just puts people together that can be a benefit to one another, and just by nature of them being them and interacting with each other, the person receives messages and communications that are beneficial towards them. They're still acting on God's behalf to bless the other person, but it doesn't necessarily mean they have divine revelation. It just means that the nature of the relationship is such that God has put the people together to be able to talk to each other and communicate with each other. The next part up is the proposal, which is Exodus 4:4-6. God tells Moses, I want you to go, and I want you to tell the people a specific message. You've seen what I did to the Egyptians. You know how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you will obey me and keep my covenant, you will be my own special treasure, or my own peculiar treasure, from among all the people on earth. For all the earth belongs to me, and you will be my kingdom of priests, my holy nation. This is the message you must give to the people of Israel. Here God introduces Himself directly. And the conversation turns to the identity motif. So in that passage, we're getting back to God showing who He is and telling Israel who they are. As of now, just so you understand, this is not a country of people. This is a bunch of nomads who don't have a homeland and former slaves who are out in the wilderness. Whereas we talked about before, raw materials there, but they're in a state of chaos. There's no organization, there's no structure. You just got a bunch of people. So God says, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and you know how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. No longer does God identify Himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He now presents Himself as the God of their deliverance. So we've gone from indirect communication, where at first God introduces Himself to Moses and tells Moses to tell the people, I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now they've had some experience, and He references their experiences to let them know who's speaking. And you'll see this a lot of times as you study Scripture and you study Old Testament communication and the prophets talk. God will always reference who I've been up to this point, so you know who's speaking to you. That way He can establish a basis for trust and understanding. This is what we've been through together. This is what I've done. This is who I am. The compilation of indirect communications that they have witnessed and experienced speaks to God's power and benevolence towards the Hebrew people, and He identifies Himself in these terms. This is God establishing a basis for trust. The next thing is discussing, who am I? In verses 5 and 6. God proposes this to the Hebrew people. So first verse, fourth verse, who is God? I am the person who's delivered you on eagle's wings and brought you to me. Verse 5 and 6, he's proposing something new to them. If you will obey me and keep my covenant, you will be my own special people or treasure from among all people on the earth. For all the earth belongs to me, and you will be my kingdom of priests, my holy nation. God then proposes this to his Hebrew people. He offers to establish a covenant with them, wherein they will become his special people upon the earth. He offers them to make them a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Up to this point in their history, the Hebrew people have been nomads and slaves. They've never been a nation, as they have no possessed land. The very term Hebrew in that region was a racial epithet meaning outsider. I don't know if you guys knew this or not, but to be called a Hebrew originally in Genesis was a derogatory term, referring to this bunch of outside people that were descended from Abraham. I'm sure you all can think of some examples of some other kinds of terminology. We never identified, we don't really necessarily know that this label was originally something that was considered disparaging, and that they're those outside folks. They have no land, they are nobody, they don't mean anything. So that's how they were always referred to up to that point. But he offers to make a nation of them. Inviting them to be his people under his covenant, he is inviting them into a distinct and unique relationship with him, wherein they will be transformed into something that they have never been. This is a marriage proposal and then some. Like I said, and the reason that this is key is we see Red Sea, we see tablets. In between them, God proposes to these folks. So it's not like God just delivers them and says, okay, now I own you. And the reason that we look at this as a proposal, even though it says that God commanded Moses to say, if you keep my commandments, is that the people had to come back with a response. The Lord called from the mountain, give these instructions to the family of Jacob. This is the message you must give to the people of Israel. So Moses returned from the mountain and called the elders together and told them everything the Lord commanded, and the people responded together, we'll do it. So God, remember, and some of you weren't here last week, but we said it kind of doesn't fit the regional and the cultural climate of that time to say that God asked them something. God doesn't ask, God issues commands. But God said, go tell these people this, and the people said, okay. That's a conversation, it's a two-way conversation. He's proposing something to them. He invites them to interact with him and leaves them to decide if they will accept his revelation. He is offering to bring order to the chaos of their existence. So these communication principles that we're talking about, you can see at play throughout this conversation. God tells them, this is who I am, this is who I want you to be. Now y'all got to make a decision. That's really the communication motif for a lot of what God does with us. This is who I am, this is who you can be, and then you have to decide whether or not you're going to accept that, whether or not you're going to push back against it, whether or not you're going to wrestle with it and try to figure out, is this really true? It's a dynamic, it's a conversation. And so this is the basic format from what what we've been dealing with. And it's not just for people who are unsaved. That's the way God calls people who are unsaved, but that's also how God works with people who are saved or who are believers and moves them forward. And we said before, we said it earlier, he'll make a statement, we ask questions, he says something else, his answers tell us something else. There's a back and forth and a relational dialogue with that. So we've got this wedding marriage proposal. We've got the conversation here. I want to take a minute to take a look at the 10 Commandments. And we're not going to actually look at the commandments. I want to look at God giving the law. Okay? And why God gave the law. What exactly it represents, how they would have seen it. Because there's a lot of people who have a really hard time with the 10 Commandments being given. The idea that we talk about God as a loving God, God is a gracious God, God is a good God. We say God's not a legalistic God, but he gives Israel 613 laws to follow. What's with that? Why does it work like that? Where's the disconnect? I wrote a couple of questions that I've heard before. Why did God give the law? How can God be gracious and merciful and yet so legalistic as to give that many laws for a nation to follow? To begin with, we have to understand his proposal. Okay, God makes a proposition, they accept the proposal. God proposes to them, they say, okay, yeah. He proposes to make them a kingdom of his priests, his holy nation. He offered to make them a special or peculiar people among all of the earth to reflect a special and peculiar God who was different than any other God that had ever been known or heard of. So his proposal, I will make you a kingdom of holy people. I will make you a nation of royal priests. Means you're going to be a people that show my peculiarity and my distinction in some way, shape, or form that other nations look at and understand there's something different about this God. Let me not. How am I doing on time? Don't have. There is a problem with blending Christianity, where we forget that we are supposed to be a distinct people representing a distinct God. Our God is unique. Our God is different than what other people may believe, what other people may think. And we understand that our God is different, not just on the basis of what's written, but on the basis of experience. And when people can't tell the difference, and I'm not talking about skirts, earrings, hairstyles, but when in dealing and interacting with people, they can't tell the difference between us and somebody else, there's a problem there, because what he calls Israel to and what he calls us to is to be a kingdom of his priests and a holy nation of his people. So if dealing with me and the way I treat you and the way I talk to you, you feel like you might as well be dealing with anybody on the street or in the corner, there's a problem there. If the way that I react to the attitude that you give me reminds you, if I go upside your head the way I'd like to, and you know everybody else would go upside in the night, then there's a problem there, because that's not exactly how God does stuff. I mean, God goes upside people's heads and then it ends up being biblical, but that's his business. We're supposed to show a different side of him. Amen. So he calls them to be people that reflect who he is. Did I miss a page here? So, okay, let me move on. The law. Why did God give the law? It's a mechanism for giving form, function, or distinction to a nation that is as unique as God is. So he gives the law. He says, I want you to be my people, I'm going to be my people, and I'm going to be your God. We're going to be married. We're going to be partnered. We're going to be in a relationship. They say, okay. He says, all right, here's what this is going to look like. Mm-hmm. That's the law. 10 Commandments and the law. All of it exists as a way of giving form, function, and distinction, creating a nation, giving it purpose, giving it identity. The law was a codified communication of how his kingdom of priests are to reflect his distinct nature that stands for generations to reflect on. This was also something of a wedding gift to a newly formed nation, because in that day and time, the gods were known based on superstition, based on trying to read chicken bones, based on trying to read weather patterns. We're going to guess what God expects from us and who God is based on all of this other stuff. And their perception of the gods and understanding of the gods were that they were very fickle. Because one minute the God would be happy, and then all of a sudden the God's ticked off, and we don't know why the God's ticked off, and we have to guess why the God's ticked off. And what I did this year might not have worked for what I need next year. It was a very, very unsecure way of trying to interact and relate with God. That God would take that Yahweh, Hebrew God, would take the time to actually put this stuff in writing and say, I'm going to bind myself to this. So you know what to expect out of me, and you know what I'm looking for out of you. It creates a solid and concrete relationship for them by which they can interact with them. So this is one again. I want you to understand my faithfulness. So I'm going to write this in stone so you understand this is who I am and this is what I'm looking for out of you. Whereas priests of other gods had to guess through observation the expectations of flighty and consistent deities, the God of Israel would give them in writing his expectations. we're going to talk more about understanding God through historical record and through writings at a later date. But I wanted to take the time to actually get you to understand what exactly the Ten Commandments were and how they looked at it. To Western Greek influenced post Enlightenment readers, one might wonder, what do these laws have to do with reflecting the nature of God? How do purple ornate robes for priests reflect God's nature? How does catfish profane God? Does God really hate pigs? Why does God make certain allowances in the law for things that seem to us to be cruel and inhuman? So it's easy for me to sit up here and say, okay, God gave the law so that way people would know how to represent him. But somebody, and if you gave that answer to somebody, somebody's going to ask, what does catfish and whether or not I eat pork or not, and what the color of the robe that I wear is if I'm a priest. What does any of that have to do with reflecting God's character?
Yes.
God just hate catfish. He made the catfish. Why can't? What's his problem with scaly fish?
Yeah.
Though you don't necessarily see the connection between the two. And the shortest, though somewhat complex answer to that is that everything delineated in the law was given in a time, culture, and worldview that even the most academic among us will find difficult to truly understand on an empathetic level. It would be impossible for the modern reader to fully grasp what was being communicated to the Hebrews and surrounding nations watching Israel. At best, one can guess. Let's talk about high context versus low context communication. Who remembers the difference?
Low context is where everybody, it's on, they understand, and high is when it goes above their head, or that you assume that they understand and they don't. I always get it mixed up.
Think about your viewpoint from an airplane versus a viewpoint from standing in a tree.
So it'd be,
How much do you see when you are looking at it from an airplane?
everything. But
How much detail do you see?
you don't see a lot of detail.
You don't see a lot of detail, but Jake?
It's like low context is like summing up everything, and then high context is giving all the details.
Other way around.
Other way around. Yeah.
And it's a communication form. There's high context communication, low context communication. In high context communication, we assume that there is a common experience shared by everybody. So we don't have to give all the details because everybody already knows what we're talking about. And I've used for the example, somebody says, we had church today. Everybody in this room knows what they're talking about. They're not saying that we actually had a service. They're talking about what actually went on in the service and that it was a good thing. Nobody has to explain what happened. You just know automatically, okay, it was a good, and you have a visual, an idea in your head when you hear of what that means. High context communication. On the other hand, low context communication would be if you were to go over to, we'll say, China and make that same statement, then they think you're talking about the actual service. And you have to explain to them, no, having church means this. It doesn't mean just that there was a building and we got to, no, there's a common experience that doesn't have to be explained in high context communication, right? We have to, and
So high is, when you say it doesn't have to be explained, we just assume that everyone in here knows what we're talking about.
Yep. Everybody knows what we're talking about because we share a set of cultural experiences.
We share, okay.
Everybody's been to a church service where you get out and say, we don't have church.
Yeah.
You know what that looks like. So nobody has to explain it to you. Except for people that have never been to that church service and have no idea what you're talking about. And then you have to engage in low context communication where you explain that the singer sang this and the band was on point and the preacher did this, and you have to explain to them what having church means. That's low context communication where you have to get into the details of it. Okay? I used another example. I talked about a tech blog. Anybody remember the tech blog example? Where we're talking about looking for tweets and somebody writes in a tech blog that all of the tweets are stored in the cloud and can be accessed from the web on the tablet. Everybody knows what this, for the most part, knows what we're talking about, right? I mean, for the most part, you guys know what I just said. Take that statement, give it to Moses. What's Moses going to see when he reads that? Birds, clouds, spider webs, and rocks. Because the statement was a high context statement. And to convert it to a low context statement is going to require a few millennia of technical updates from Moses. High context, low context communication. So we see the law and we wonder, what does some of this stuff have to do with reflecting God's character? What does some of this stuff have to do with making the nation distinct amongst other nations? How does all 613 rules and regulation, what does any of that stuff have to do with? It's a high context conversation. And some of it we're not going to get. Some of it we will, some people will insist on looking at it from a Western modern standard and completely miss what God is trying to do in that conversation, because they're evaluating it outside of time and outside of the culture it was delivered to. So that's kind of that's the best answer that you can give to somebody who's serious about trying to understand the difference. Now, if somebody just wants to nitpick or they just have their opinions and they think what they think, well, then you're welcome to think what you can think. But if you're actually looking to understand, how does this work? How does the law work? How does this whole thing work? That's the best answer that we can give you, is that we can try to understand the culture, but there are certain things they understood, even if you can't, even if we don't, because our time and culture is completely removed, what it is that God was trying to show and how he made them unique and different from the law. So one of the things I really wanted to pull out of this and really wanted to highlight in this is, and we're going to touch on one more thing before we go. I want to just see the progression in God's communication and development with Israel. Introduces himself to Moses and goes through this progression of showing himself, making a declaration, establishing familiarity with him, offering a new future and a new destiny to him. Moses has to decide what he's going to do with it. Come out, brings Israel out, does the same thing, has the same kind of conversation with him. Familiar basis for us to be able to trust, speaks in ways that we can understand, offers a proposition, a new declaration, leaves them to decide what to do with it. They say yes. He shows himself some more. And that pattern repeats itself throughout the Bible when people say yes. Now, when people say no, then they're stuck in a rut. There are plenty of times in Scripture, and you will see, talk about God speaking to people through people. God sends somebody to talk, and nobody listens. And so he sends somebody else to talk, and nobody listens. And then all the stuff that he's been talking about finally happens, but that's a whole nother conversation. So that's what I want you to bring from the model of that, is that there's an actual proposal that happens where God proposes marriage to the nation of Israel and says, I want to be in a relationship with y'all. Will you marry me? Mm-hmm. And they say yes. And that's the model of salvation and the transformation that happens. We don't look at it on those terms. We don't see it on those terms necessarily because we've got this whole other church cultural perspective that we teach with heaven and hell and escaping hell. But God is proposing relationship, partnership, and he communicates within this manner that shows who am I and who are you. Now, what does the voice of God sound like? And this is kind of a precursor or a tease to the next lesson. The 9th verse. There, then the Lord says to Moses, I will come to you in a thick cloud, Moses, so the people themselves can hear me when I speak to you. They will always trust you. Thus far in this lesson series, we have focused on trends and tendencies in God's communication, but as of yet, we have not dealt with the issue of hearing God's voice. In this verse, God says that the people will hear him when he speaks to Moses. Then in verse 16 through 19, we find the description of God's voice as the sound of thunder or blast from a ram's horn. But Moses heard discernible words. So you've got, and if you read back through the passage, or read the chapter really, because I skipped a little bit of it. But you have the nation of Israel around this mountain. Moses goes up the mountain, or Moses is there. They hear what they describe as sounds of ram's horns and sounds of thunder. That's what they hear. Moses hears the same thing. Moses hears words. That's a whole nother conversation and a whole nother lesson in and of itself. When God is speaking to one person and nobody else hears it, or they can tell something's going on, but they don't get it because they're not the ones who actually heard it. But I don't have time to deal with it. Over the last 40 to 50 years, biblical cultural anthropologists have teamed up with neurologists and psychiatrists in an attempt to understand from a scientific perspective, since America is a science-driven culture, what a person experiences when they hear God's voice. Is it audible through the ears? Is there some other cognitive process that can only be best be described as hearing? What's the difference between a psychotic break where somebody's hearing voices and a preacher who claims to hear God speaking to him or her? What did Moses hear at the bush? How is it that at Sinai the people heard thunder, but Moses understood the thunder? The beginning of these types of answers is found in understanding something called altered states of consciousness, which we abbreviate as ASOC. Science is discovering and positing that the human body is hardwired to be able to transcend consensual reality and experience reality on altered levels. I'm going to explain and unpack this a lot more as we move forward. This is just to touch on it a little bit. This is not just a religious phenomenon. Professional athletes, musicians, writers, florists, students can all have ASOC experiences. However, the shifts may be so subtle that they go unnoticed. It is theorized that a normal person transfers through 5 to 10 states of consciousness within the course of a normal day. Anybody ever heard of driver's hypnosis? Where you're driving and you get where you're going and don't necessarily remember the trip? That is considered, if you that is a form that is considered a form of hypnosis. It is considered by the people who study these things to be an altered state of conscious, where your brain kind of drones out, your body still moves, you're still cognizant, you still are in full control. But when you think back to what happened, you have the trip you don't necessarily remember. Your brain is operating in a different state than it is when you're sitting in a classroom and sitting there taking notes. But then when the professor gets really boring, your brain shifts into another gear and your consciousness alters itself again. And then you can't tell what he was talking about because you've drowned out. The brain shifts gears, and they've hooked people up to EEGs and monitored neurokinetic activity and monitored brain waves to see what exactly is going on. It gets really, really intense and really deep, much more so than what we can get into here, but we're going to touch on some of this stuff. Neurophysiologists and neurologists have measured brain activity on EEGs and found clear, consistent changes in neural signals within specific regions of the brain that directly correlate to people claiming to being in the zone or spaced out. More will be said of these studies in the next lesson, but to briefly address the passage at hand, the process of I skipped straight over that. Process of consecration was culturally understood to be a preparation for a spiritual experience. If you look back through the verses, and I skipped over it, but it says God tells Moses to go consecrate the people for 3 days. Moses comes down, consecrates the people for 3 days. Whatever that process looked like, it was supposed to prepare them to be able to experience God's presence. That's what consecration, we've talked about setting aside just from a general level. From a cultural standpoint, and this is 80% of the world's cultures. America and westernized culture is one of the few cultures that does not have some kind of ritualistic, ceremonial preparation to experience some kind of, whether it's transcendental meditation, whether you're talking about shamanistic when I say that these folks are studying this stuff, they're not just studying Christian altered states. They have studied across the course of most of the cultures that are out available now, most of the religious climates, and look through history to find people entering into altered states of consciousness and what common traits, common experiences, and common tendencies you'll find across the board. And then started to try to study it from a scientific and neurological perspective. So we talk about hearing dreams, we talk about having dreams, seeing visions, hearing voices, hearing God's voice. What does all that stuff mean from a scientific perspective? Are people actually hearing it? There is a lot of study that has started with it. Like I said, this started probably within the 70s and has progressed, moving 1970s, but within the 70s, moving forward. there's a lot of study about what it looks like, where it comes from, what's actually going on. Is it superstition? We're going to kind of unpack and try to unravel that. Like I said, 80% of the world, we're one of the few people that don't have that. What's funny though, as I come doing in, is that what we don't know that apostolic folks tapped into that accidentally in trying to have a Holy Ghost experience. And some of y'all grew up in the same kind of churches that I did. When they have you on your knees, calling Jesus and clapping hands and all of that, there's something called bottom-up stimulation. There's something called top-down stimulation. And I'll explain it more later, but that's what's called a bottom-up stimulation, where you're trying to get the mind and the body to an excited state. One second.
That actually happens to me once.
Yeah.
A couple times.
When they're doing that and they talk about getting out of self, they didn't know what they were talking about. They didn't understand from a scientific perspective. They didn't even understand it from a cultural perspective. They will say divine influence or dumb luck stumbled into something that, from this branch of science's perspective, would say that they put themselves in an altered state of consciousness where they were able to experience a spiritual encounter with God. That would be the scientific explanation for what the whole thing is from the people who study this stuff. Now, as I read the material, there's some conclusions that they come to I agree with, some that I don't. I'm going to scale it down to a general working knowledge to be able to explain some of these things. And what did they hear and what did people say? And I let Carmen look at one chart of something in one book that I have, and it gets deep into the sympathetic, parasympathetic nerves, what part of the brain that you're talking about being stimulated, what ideally they theorize 200 to 220 beats per minute is ideal for a bottom-up stimulation. They've got a lot of science behind this stuff, and we're going to deal with it a little bit to present ideas and theories of what happens when somebody says they have a dream, what happens when somebody says that they have a vision, and demystify some of it. So because we are a Western people and we have to understand everything, as opposed to just saying it's a mystery and let it go, we're going to try to deal with this because I want you to be equipped to be able to discuss things intelligently as they come up. When somebody says, well, there are still churches that get down on your knees and clap your hands. But when they do that, or shout music, why is shouting music always fast? Why is it? Yep. Well, whether they realize it or not, there's something that's actually functional to that. Or James Brown. James Brown is I swear, and I will go to my grave with this. He didn't know what he was doing, but he tapped it. It's trance music. James Brown's music is trance music. That's why they sat and ran the same loops over and over again. And when you have it run like that, it gets people into it. His music was somewhat innovative. I mean, it was especially for its time. But what really made James Brown was that he had folks into what he was doing.
Yeah.
Because the environment and it was a bottom-up sensory experience because before that you had different movements and you had the music was completely different. James Brown just sitting running one lick for 15, 20 minutes.
Yeah.
Bro knows what I'm talking about.
It's right.
Yep.
Yeah.
Gets at you, especially if you're already a willing participant in it and susceptible to it. And that doesn't mean good, bad, or I'm not talking about demonic things. I'm just saying that the experience that people would have in the James Brown concert was largely related to trance music. That's some gospel according to Mike. But I think I'm pretty sure I could back that up. So just two main takeaways from today. God speaks to people through people, and we're going to deal with that a lot more. Just introduce that as one conversational or one. We just used it as a moment to launch off of that. But also, I want you to understand look at the commandments differently. That the giving of the law was not just some burdensome rules and regulations, but really what it was God establishing and creating something that hadn't existed and providing them with the documentation to say, here, you can trust and rely on me. This is how we're going to work. You're not going to have to guess who I am and what I'm looking for. This is it right here. Nobody, no, there is no other religion in that area where you see God binding himself to a contract or to a covenant that's been written out like that. It is so when people say that Judaism stole from other religions, there's commonalities, and we can have an anthropological discussion about comparative literary analysis. But there are some things that are very unique and very revolutionary to Judaism, to Christianity, and people who don't see it mainly because they haven't done the legwork to find it out, or they're just looking to discredit Christianity. One or two. Questions to anybody that did I see your hand up earlier?
Me?
Yeah, you.
No.
No, you sure?
You must have been reading my mind.
Amen.
Well, since I pictured what?
Oh, I put it away.
Okay. All right. Well, to those who are watching, I hope that you enjoyed the broadcast, that you found it interesting. Hope you were blessed by it, and I will catch you again on June 5th, which is the next time we meet. Remember that we are off July 5th. Thank you, July 5th. We are off for Father's Day. I don't want to pull anybody away from their family at 3 o'clock when everybody's trying to go to dinner. Plus, I got to work, so it keeps me from having to take a day off of work. But mainly, the main consideration is that I don't want to pull you guys away from your family because I've taken days off to be able to do this, and I would gladly continue to do it. So we'll see you on July 5th. Got a couple